The man of death. Accounting, the shadow of the cipher. There are numbers that weigh more than lead, numbers that pierce history, leaving a cold and empty echo. 80-10,000, 90,000. It's the figure that came out of the mouth of a man named Otto Ohlendorf. He said it not with fury, nor with regret, but with the coldness of an accountant who has just closed the cash register at the end of a long and monotonous day. This man, with his sharp face, thin-rimmed glasses, and impeccable grey suit, did not look like the face of absolute evil. He looked like a bureaucrat, an economist, in fact, with a doctorate. But he was the commander of Einsatzgruppe D, one of the 4 Nazi death squads that were unleashed on the Eastern Front. His meticulous and systematic work was to transform vast swathes of Eastern Europe into an unnamed cemetery. This is the story of how ideology can rot the soul, of how efficiency turns into terror, and how one man, in the name of a state, becomes the most precise machine of annihilation. We are going to descend into the depths of the mind of a mass murderer, not to justify it, but to understand the mechanism by which a human being accepts that 90,000 lives are just a footnote in the great book of history. The awakening of horror. There is a geographical point in the south of Ukraine where the land still holds secrets. It's called Simferopol. By the end of 1941, the air was thick, not only with skin-cutting cold, but with the pungent smell of gunpowder and fear. Thousands of people, men, women, children, were driven into ravines, into hastily dug pits, or simply onto the roadside. Ohlendorf was there. He was always there. He didn't get his hands dirty. He didn't need to. But it was he who gave the order, who oversaw implementation, a neat clinical term for industrial slaughter. The scene was repeated over and over again. The truck, the sound of the engine idling, the stifled scream that never became one, the dry impact. I remember the fear in his eyes, not panic, but an icy acceptance, as if they knew that their destiny was already written. They only asked for it to end quickly, for the children. This voice, recreated, is the echo of a witness, perhaps a German soldier who briefly felt human, or perhaps one of the few souls who managed to hide and see. Ohlendorf, however, saw no human beings. He saw objectives. He saw an ideological threat, a racial charge that had to be removed to ensure the purity of a 1,000-year-old future Reich. It is the difference between killing out of passion and killing out of doctrine. The first is a crime of passion. The second is the bureaucracy of hell, the extermination machine. The uniqueness of Ohlendorf and Einsatzgruppe D is their methodology. Other groups killed. They documented. They were the elite of death, made up not only of thugs, but of intellectuals, lawyers, musicians, and yes, economists. Ohlendorf, in particular, was obsessed with efficiency. In his later testimony, during the Nuremberg Trials, a chilling detail comes to light. He complained that the shootings were inefficient. Inefficient. They were traumatic for the executioners, left a messy scene, and used up too much ammunition. He proposed a cleaner, faster alternative, the gas van, an adapted vehicle which suffocated the victims with carbon monoxide while they traveled to the grave, a method that, according to Ohlendorf, was less stressful for the men in his command. Herein lies the deepest horror, total dehumanization, not only of the victim, but of the executioner, a man who cares more about the psychological well-being of his killers than the lives of the 90,000 souls he has erased. His life became a constant search for the most economical way to carry out the genocide. Chapter 1. The System Architect. The Geometry of the Cold Soul. the invisible thread of ambition. To understand the abyss that opened up in Otto Ohlendorf's soul, we must trace his path not from gunpowder and horror, but from the dust of a quiet farmhouse in northern Germany. He was born in 1977 in Hoheneggelsen, a land of orderly fields and wide skies. His initial life was not that of a revolutionary or a warrior, but that of a young man gifted for order and analysis. His father was a farmer, a man of the land who measured success in harvests. Otto, however, measured the world in graphs and statistics. Ohlendorf's fascination was not the blood, but the structure. He studied economics and law at the prestigious universities of Leipzig and Göttingen. His doctoral thesis, of almost palpable coldness, dealt with the economic policy of coal, a dry, technical issue, a reflection of the man he would be, a being who could distill the complexity of the world into manageable numbers, eliminating all emotional turbulence. This is the portrait of a man who hated chaos. The call of the new order, Ohlendorf's entry into the National Socialist German Workers' Party in 1925, was not a youthful outburst. It was a logical choice. Interwar Germany was the epitome of disorder, hyperinflation, the humiliation of Versailles, street fighting. Nazism, with its promise of a strong, purified, and above all, disciplined nation, resonated deeply in his academic and systematic mind. He saw in the movement not a group of thugs, but the only force capable of imposing a rigid structure on the country. His true fate was sealed not in the uniform of the SA, the initial militia of the party, but in the black and silver uniform of the Schutzstaffel, SS. The SS was more than an organization. He was the embodiment of the racial and ideological elite, and within it, Ohlendorf found his intellectual home, the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, the intelligence service. Under the tutelage of the ruthless Reinhard Heydrich, the SD became the ideological laboratory of the Reich. They did not limit themselves to spying. His task was to shape the psyche of the nation, to document every rumor, every criticism, every ideological deviation. Ohlendorf, with his economic background, quickly rose to the head of important departments, such as economic and social affairs. He was not a man of rallies. He was a man of reports. Their offices in Berlin were quiet, filled with cigarette smoke and maps. He taught us that control is not gained in the trenches, but in statistics. He made us believe that we were the doctors of the German corps, and that purging was the only possible medicine. This is the recreated voice of an SD colleague, a subordinate who admired Ohlendorf's analytical precision without seeing the monstrosity that such precision would engender. The death analyzer machine Ohlendorf was not an impulse killer. He was a killer by design. Through the SD, he had access to reports detailing the Jewish question, the Bolshevik threat, and the racial instability that, according to propaganda, undermined German strength. His mind, trained for economics, processed these concepts as if they were macroeconomic variables. In this distorted view, human life was stripped of its inherent value. Jews were not neighbors or citizens. They were an economic burden, a risk factor in the equation of the racial purity of the Reich. The solution that he and his colleagues began to outline was not an act of revenge, but an administrative measure necessary for the well-being of the nation. It is the subtle but terrifying difference between killing out of visceral hatred and killing out of doctrinal conviction. The second is cold, relentless, almost infinite in its capacity for destruction. The double face of banality. In the 1940s, Ohlendorf was a man of immense power, and yet she led an impeccable domestic life. He married the woman he loved, had 5 children. He would return home, eat dinner, read the newspaper, and, probably, wonder if milk in the market was too expensive. Herein lies the terror of his story, compartmentalization. Hauptsturmführer Ohlendorf was the most dedicated father. I remember one afternoon, we were planning a raid on the Dutch border, and he stopped the meeting because he had to go home to help his oldest son with a math problem. The next day, he returned with a plan of action for the raid, as detailed and neat as if it were a school lesson. For him, everything was a task that had to be solved with precision. People were the problem. Families were their sanctuary. This duality is key. Ohlendorf felt no guilt because he convinced himself that he was not doing wrong. He was serving a higher good that transcended individual morality. Her life was divided into two hermetically sealed spheres, that of husband and father, full of affection and order, and that of the SS commander, full of duty and death. An invisible wall of ideology separated the two worlds, allowing the sensitive intellectual to coexist with the cold killer. This is the basis of the banality of evil. When the mind becomes an instrument of the state, even the most utter horror feels like just another job that must be completed by 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Time was running out. His theory, his doctrine of extermination, was about to descend from the office into the fields of mud and blood on the Eastern Front. Chapter 2. The Unleashed Beast, the Death Commando. D. The Invasion and the Secret Mandate. June of 1941. The sky burned over the continent. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was not conceived as a conventional military campaign to gain territory. It was, from the beginning, an ideological war of extermination. The land to the east of Germany was seen by the Reich as the living space, Lebensraum, that had to be cleansed of its undesirable inhabitants, Bolshevism, Slavic, and above all, the Jew. The Wehrmacht, the regular army, would move fast, but the work of systematic annihilation required a different tool. He required the Einsatzgruppen, the operational groups of the SS. These 4 death squads, A, B, C, and D, had a single mandate: to follow immediately behind the front line and implement ideological and racial cleansing. Einsatzgruppe D was assigned to Army Group South. Their bloodshed would stretch through Moldova, southern Ukraine, the Crimean Peninsula, and, if the advance allowed, the Caucasus. And at the helm of this horror engine was Dr. Otto Ohlendorf. The death commando portrait Einsatzgruppe D was not an undisciplined horde. It consisted of about 600 men, divided into several Sonderkommandos and tail commandos, operation units. And what's most disturbing is the composition of their ranks. They weren't just SS thugs. There were intellectuals, lawyers, musicians, theology students. Ohlendorf, the Economist, had been sent to lead a battalion of Nazism's educated elite. This was proof that ideology can corrupt any level of education. The assassination order, although verbal and secret, was known to the leadership. Ohlendorf himself declared at Nuremberg that the order for the murder of Jews, gypsies, and political commissars came directly from Himmler, the chief of the SS, and that this order had been received by all the commanders of the Einsatzgruppen. The mission of Einsatzgruppe D was the most extensive and cruel of all in geographical terms. As the troops advanced, Ohlendorf's commando was deployed, operating with a surgical precision that reflected the mindset of its leader. Ohlendorf's methodology, the accounting of horror. What distinguishes Ohlendorf's operation is the methodological coldness he applied. He took his obsession with the efficiency of the Berlin offices to the camps of Ukraine. The process became systematic, almost bureaucratic, with the sole aim of maximizing the death toll while minimizing the resources and trauma of the executioners. 1. Arrival and deception. Units would arrive in a city or town, often announcing a resettlement or a relocation for security purposes. People gathered, sometimes carrying their belongings. 2. Grouping and dehumanization. Once reunited, the prisoners, almost always entire families, were taken to an isolated assembly point. The next step was dispossession. They were ordered to hand over valuables and, in a detail that reveals Ohlendorf's mentality, to strip naked. Why? To avoid the waste of clothes and to rob the victim of his last dignity before dying. 3. Execution as an assembly line. They were forced to march in small groups to the edge of a pit, natural or dug by themselves. Executions were carried out by firing squad. Ohlendorf, the master of efficiency, soon realized the problems of this method: the consumption of ammunition, the disorder of the scene, and the psychological trauma in his own men. Narrator's reflection. Absolute evil is often disguised as logic. For Ohlendorf, death was not an act of anger, but a technical problem that had to be solved: how to kill 90,000 people in the fastest, cleanest, and cheapest way possible. When the mind focuses only on efficiency, it forgets that the end product is the annihilation of a life, of a history, of a soul. The coldest solution: the gas van. It was this pursuit of efficiency that led Ohlendorf to one of the most macabre innovations of the Holocaust. He proposed and applied the use of the gas van, Gaswagen. The van was a hermetically sealed truck. The victims, children, women, and the elderly were carried in the back. As the truck made its way to the previously dug mass grave, carbon monoxide from the exhaust gases was redirected into the locked compartment, suffocating the occupants along the way. In his post-war testimony, Ohlendorf defended this method as a humanitarian measure, not for the victims, but for the executioners. I felt that it was something unbearable for men to shoot in this way. So, it occurred to me that this was less stressful for men. This is the climax of dehumanization. A man who plans a genocide cares about the work stress of his killers, not the agony of the 90,000 victims. The trail of paper soaked in blood Ohlendorf's hallmark was the count. After each massacre, the Einsatzgruppen were to send detailed reports to Berlin. These were the famous Einsatzgruppenmeldungen, or operational event reports, neat, typed, with exact figures of those executed by categories: Jews, commissars, gypsies. Command D, under Ohlendorf, generated some of the most systematic and frightening reports of the war. A recreated example from the time: Simferopol, December 1941, Sonderkommando 10B unit. Total number of executions, 3,522. Breakdown: Jews, 3,482. Partisans, 30. Political commissars, 10. Recovered material: 100 kilos of dental gold, 2,000 pairs of boots, various jewelry. The operation was executed with maximum efficiency and without internal incidents. Ohlendorf reviewed these reports, the accountant of the death verifying that the massacre was being carried out according to the ideological presupposition. When the war ended, it was he who, under oath, provided the number that would resonate forever: 90,000 lives erased from the face of the earth under his command. The land of the East had become a vast desk where he, Dr. Otto Ohlendorf, signed the final balance of death. The shadow of his accounting was just beginning to spread. Chapter 3: The Crimean Executioners in a Landscape and Cold. The Death in the Sun of Crimea. The Einsatzgruppe D, under the command of Otto Ohlendorf, advanced with the fury of Army Group South, penetrating into one of the most strategic and beautiful regions of the Eastern Front, Crimea. This wasn't just a military target, It was a place that the Nazis coveted for its agrarian potential and climate. They called it the Nice of the Reich, and it was there that Ohlendorf demonstrated the maximum expression of his methodology, mass extermination carried out with administrative coldness. In late 1941, troops reached Simferopol, the capital. The air no longer smelled only of sea salt and wet earth, but of fear. Ohlendorf's order to his Sonderkommandos was immediate and precise. The Jewish population, along with gypsies and communist elements, was to be resettled. It was the code, the lie that was repeated in each town, the sweet word that hid the slaughter, the horror of the ravine, the anecdote of the hat in Simferopol. It is estimated that more than 10,000 people were killed in just 2 days. But the massacre, in Ohlendorf's mind, was not a chaotic event, but a protocol execution. One of the anecdotes, recreated from the behavior patterns of the Einsatzgruppe officers, speaks of a macabre detail. A young SS lieutenant, Klaus, who had been a promising music student in his previous life, was overseeing the shooting in a ravine on the outskirts of the city. The lieutenant, despite his discipline, showed signs of nervousness. He had vomited after the first hour of shooting. Ohlendorf arrived in his black sedan. He watched the scene, not with disgust at the slaughter, but with disorganization. He approached the lieutenant, who was sweating despite the cold. "Lieutenant," Ohlendorf said, his voice dry as the paper of his reports, "his commando is slow. Why the disorder at the edge of the pit? And where's his hat?" The lieutenant stammered. My hat, Herr Kommandant, fell into the pit during the last batch." Ohlendorf looked at the grave, which was full of bodies. "He will get it back immediately. An SS officer does not lose his uniform items. It's not about blood, Lieutenant. It's all about discipline. A disordered process produces a disordered mind, and a disordered mind is a weak link in the chain of our mission. Pick it up." The young officer had to descend among the still warm bodies to retrieve his officer's cap, while Ohlendorf looked at the clock, waiting. The lesson was not morality, but the bureaucratic order of the murder. The betrayal was not of humanity, but of protocol. Ohlendorf understood that the only way to keep his men doing what they did was to convince them that it was just a job that demanded precision and uniformity. The mask of reason and the smell of fear, Ohlendorf was a master in the art of verbal dehumanization, not only the victims, but their own men. To maintain his own sanity, or his own lie, he had to believe that the slaughter was necessary for the future. His speeches to his officers were a mixture of ideological references and economic justifications. He didn't give us hate sermons, he gave us lectures. He spoke to us of the threat of Jewish gold, of the need to guarantee the supply of food for the Reich, and of the biological purification of the race. He said that we were not murderers, but social surgeons. I remember the smell of the vodka they gave us afterwards. It was not to celebrate, but to anesthetize. No one could eat without an upset stomach, but he, Ohlendorf, ate his portion as if nothing had happened. His smell was always that of clean cologne, in contrast to the earthy and copper smell of death, the implicit testimony of a subordinate. Ohlendorf's cruelty was not the whip, but the burden of logic. He convinced his men that if they failed to kill, they were betraying their own sons and the fate of Germany. The biggest lie he sold was not to the world, but to himself and his commandos. That atrocity was a noble duty. The betrayal of morality. In this context of extermination, morality was the first victim of betrayal. The men of Einsatzgruppe D were traitors to their own humanity. There was an unspoken rule. Weakness was punished. An officer who refused to shoot or who showed compassion was immediately marginalized humiliated, and sent to a punishment post on the front lines, where the risk of death was immense. Betrayal of the soul was the only way to survive in the body of the organization, and Ohlendorf was the guardian of this betrayal. His face, always expressionless behind his glasses, was the mirror in which his men saw their own horror reflected and decided to move forward so as not to break. Chapter 4. The Double Life and the Fire of Ambition. The bureaucrat returns to Berlin by mid-1942. Einsatzgruppe D's work in the south had completed most of its initial mission. Ohlendorf's reports to Berlin were clear and chilling. It had fulfilled its quota, and the land of Crimea and Ukraine had been cleansed. His number, 90,000, had been stamped on the Reich's security reports. Ohlendorf was granted a respite, or perhaps a lateral promotion. He was recalled to Berlin to take a crucial role in the Reich's economic machine. The man who had optimized the slaughter was put to optimize the war economy. He was appointed Under-Secretary of State in the Ministry of Economy. This is a key narrative twist. The commander of a death squad transforms into a senior government official in a suit and tie, negotiating prices, production, and distribution of coal. The blood had dried from his hands, replaced by the ink of official documents. The illusion of normalcy. In Berlin, Ohlendorf led a double life. By day, in the ministries, he was Dr. Ohlendorf, the brilliant economist, the efficient bureaucrat who could dissect a supply crisis with the same coolness with which he had disarmed a people. At night, he returned home to his wife and children, to his garden, to the illusion of a respectable existence. No one in the ministry, except the highest SS hierarchs, spoke of the real reason for his promotion, his practical experience in the final solution. Silence was the great lie of the Nazi elite. They congratulated each other on their efficiency, and the past became a shared secret, a toxic bond of complicity. The ambiguity of ideological betrayal. Paradoxically, Ohlendorf was not a Nazi blindly loyal to the party in every respect. His ambition and his economistic mentality made him criticize the rampant corruption of the Nazi party and the irrational economic policies of certain leaders, such as Hermann Göring. At a private dinner in 1943, in an SS mansion in Dahlem, it is said that Ohlendorf, already with a few glasses of cognac on him, dared to criticize Göring's lack of fiscal discipline, saying quietly to another SD officer, "If the Reichsmarshal continued to steal resources for his art collections, instead of allocating them to the front, soon there would be no Reich left for anyone. He is a traitor to the nation. The discipline of purity must be extended to financial discipline, or it will all fall apart." This betrayal was not moral, but structural. He was not opposed to the ideology of extermination, but to the inefficiency and corruption that he claimed undermined the war effort and the purity of the movement. For him, a corrupt Nazi was a greater traitor than a Jew, because the corrupt weakened the order from within. It is the ultimate expression of the bureaucratic mind. Evil is acceptable, but bad accounting is a crime. The ghost of the 90,000. Although Ohlendorf returned to the carpets of Berlin, the Crimean mud and the muffled screams never left him. The trauma of the 90,000 did not manifest itself in remorse, but in an even greater rigidity. It became colder, more demanding. His gaze had emptied a little. When he was engrossed in work, it seemed that he was not there but far away, seeing something that only he could see. They say he could no longer stand the noise of an idling engine, nor the smell of carbon monoxide on the city streets. They were memories, olfactory ghosts that followed him from the east. The story of the office colleague who noticed the change. Ohlendorf's double life became a trap. He had proven his loyalty to the genocide, but his intellect compelled him to criticize the management of the very regime he had served with such devotion. His ambition had taken him to the heights of power, but his coldness had condemned him to be a hollow man, an engine of efficiency that had destroyed his own soul. The curtain of the Third Reich was approaching, and the accounting of death was about to be settled in a very different court than he had imagined. Chapter 5. The return to the Reich, the mask of economics, the perfume of death in the office. The year 1942 marked the transition for Otto Ohlendorf. He left behind the mud and the smell of copper from mass graves in Ukraine to return to the clean and tidy corridors of Berlin. He was no longer just the commander of a death squad, had been promoted. He was appointed Deputy Secretary of State in the Reich Ministry of Economics, a position of immense bureaucratic power, with direct access to the financial heartland of Nazi Germany. This wasn't a simple change of position, it was a change of mask. Ohlendorf put on his worsted wool suit, knotted his tie with the perfect knot, and sat down behind a large hardwood desk. The man who had designed the most efficient form of annihilation set to work optimizing the German war economy. His mind, trained in economics and efficiency, saw the management of genocide and the management of the economy as two sides of the same coin. Both were problems of distribution, resources, and elimination of inefficiencies. The circle of shared lies. The paradox was unbearable. Ohlendorf, the murderer of 90,000 souls, now met with industrialists, bankers, and other ministers who feigned total ignorance of the horror unfolding in the East. Silence was the cement that bound the Reich elite together. It was a shared lie that allowed everyone to maintain the facade of normalcy and respectability. At these meetings, Ohlendorf did not mention the graves. He spoke of displacement of labor, of the need to recover assets from occupied areas, and of the racial reorganization of living space. It was a neat language, a technical jargon designed to veil reality. When he spoke of recovered assets, he was referring to the dental gold, jewelry, and clothing of the victims of his Einsatzgruppe. The coldness of his soul had been perfected. Genocide was now an item of accounting. There was an air of superiority in him that was not arrogance, but a deep conviction. In meetings, if someone vaguely mentioned the events in the East, he would cut off the conversation with clinical precision. It said, "The problem of the East is being managed. Let's focus on coal. Let's focus on steel production." It was as if he was carrying an invisible shield. We knew, or intuited, but his seriousness made it easier to believe that he was just a man of numbers and not the architect of a butcher's shop, the recreated voice of a colleague from the ministry. Friction with elite corruption. Despite his loyalty to the Nazi ideological project, Ohlendorf's order-obsessed mind could not tolerate the corruption and indiscipline of other high-ranking officials. His ambition was not material, but systemic. He genuinely believed in the future of a pure, efficient, and morally disciplined Reich. His contempt focused on figures such as Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe, known for his ostentation, gluttony, and propensity for looting works of art from conquered territories. Ohlendorf considered Göring a traitor to the spirit of the SS. In the autumn of 1943, Ohlendorf was invited to a Himmler rendezvous at his field headquarters. At the table, with the chief of the SS, Ohlendorf dared to express his criticism of Göring. "My Führer, with all due respect, the Reichsmarshal's lack of fiscal discipline is not only shameful, it is dangerous," Ohlendorf said, without raising his voice. "The indiscriminate looting, the diversion of train cars loaded with art for their personal collections, while the front lines for ammunition, is a betrayal of the blood that is spilled. If the Lebensraum is to be cleansed, it must also be managed with Prussian honesty. Corruption is Bolshevik infiltration into our own ranks. Himmler, while also suspicious of Göring, was impressed by Ohlendorf's audacity and logic. This criticism earned him the respect of the most fanatical and austere faction of the SS. Ohlendorf's betrayal was not of Hitler, but of the efficiency of evil. His mind saw the corrupt not as thieves, but as factors of instability that had to be eliminated. The wear and tear of the hidden soul. But the weight of 90,000 deaths does not disappear with a change of uniform. The trauma, in Ohlendorf's case, manifested itself not as moral guilt, but as chronic emotional exhaustion. Witnesses of the time noticed that Dr. Ohlendorf became thinner, his face sharper, and his eyes behind the glasses took on a distant, glassy look. He is said to have developed an almost physical aversion to certain noises and smells, the sound of idling diesel engines, the memory of gas vans, the smell of metal or burning gasoline, the memory of the pit. These were the sensory ghosts of his past. To combat them, he immersed himself in work with an unhealthy obsession. He worked until midnight, moving figures, rewriting economic plans, trying to prove that, at least on paper, he could create the absolute order that the chaos of war and slaughter had tried to disturb. His mind was a fortress, and the discipline of work was the only wall that separated him from madness or the recognition of his own monstrosity. It was the double life of a man who tried to bury the horror of the graves under mountains of economic paperwork. Chapter 6. The collapse and blind loyalty, the shifting wind of war. From 1943 onwards, the roar of war began to sound different. The defeats at Stalingrad and the setback at Kursk made it clear that the Reich's promise of victory was fading. For men like Ohlendorf, the collapse was not only military but also ideological. The system in which he had believed, and for which he had committed unimaginable crimes, was crumbling because of the inefficiency, chaos, and corruption that he had so much denounced. Despite the evidence, Ohlendorf's faith in the historical necessity of the Nazi mission was not broken. He became more rigid, more fanatical in his demand for order and discipline. His allegiance was not to a leader, but to a concept, the 1,000-year-old Reich, the last effort of coldness. In his duties as Deputy Secretary of State, Ohlendorf devoted his last years of war to a macabre and futile task, trying to save the German economy so that it could sustain the war long enough for a technological or military miracle to occur. He traveled throughout Germany, visiting factories and barracks, reprimanding administrators for waste, and demanding incessant production. It is said that, during an inspection of a munitions factory in Silesia, Ohlendorf discovered a small warehouse full of consumer goods confiscated from Hungarian Jews that were being used as bribes to keep the factory workers happy. The officer in charge argued that it was necessary to avoid a strike. Ohlendorf looked at him with her cold expressionlessness. The motivation for work should be loyalty to the nation, not the consumption of stolen goods. In an act of demonstration of power and discipline, he ordered all property to be taken out into the courtyard and publicly burned. The workers and the officer saw how the skins, watches, and toys were consumed. The lesson was not saving. It was the supremacy of discipline. The officer, accused of financial disloyalty, was immediately transferred to the most dangerous front. Ohlendorf's cruelty was always a calculated cruelty, designed to cement his concept of order. The betrayal of the inner circle. As the ring of steel closed over Berlin, the betrayals became internal. SS officers began to ensure their own survival. Some tried to negotiate peace separately. Others destroyed documents. Ohlendorf, however, remained rigidly loyal. He rejected any suggestion of capitulation or negotiation. In a meeting with Himmler in the early 1945s, when chaos was already absolute, Ohlendorf was one of the few who advocated total resistance. He was the man who had divested himself of all morality to serve a cause, and he could not betray it at the final moment. Their loyalty was a kind of ideological rigor mortis. The screenshot, The Economist and Fear. The final collapse of the war found him in northern Germany. He tried to go underground, but with the mind of a bureaucrat, he made the mistake of keeping detailed documentation about his past in the SS and his work in the Ministry of Economy. He tried to hide his true identity, but his rigidity, precise manner of speaking, and appearance as an intellectual contrasted with the post-war chaos. He was captured by British forces in May 1945. The contrast was overwhelming. The commander, who had ordered the deaths of tens of thousands of people, was arrested by soldiers who had probably never heard his name. His first fear was not judgment, but disorder. British soldiers found him with a suitcase full of financial reports and letters from his wife. One of the interrogators, a young officer, asked him about his past. Ohlendorf, sitting in a wooden chair in a temporary barracks, began to speak in the calm, didactic voice of a teacher. He did not lie about his identity, but about his motivation. "My role was always that of an economist," he said. "I was there to ensure the administrative efficiency and security of the Reich. War is a matter of resources. I don't hate anyone. I only applied the logic of historical necessity." The British officer fell silent, impressed by the coldness with which this man with glasses and an elegant suit described the genocide as if it were a settling of scores. Ohlendorf's final lie was not to deny the facts, but to deny the moral content of the facts. The beginning of memory. The capture of Otto Ohlendorf was not only the end of an SS officer, but the beginning of the disclosure process. The man who had meticulously documented his crimes was about to become the key witness for the Nuremberg prosecutor's office. His analytical mind, which had served to organize death, would now serve to document the horror before the world. The shadow of the 90,000 was about to invade the courtroom, revealing the terrifying link between intellect, bureaucracy, and mass annihilation. His trial, the judgment of the Einsatzgruppe, would be one of the darkest chapters in human history. Chapter 7. The Nuremberg Stand, the Accountant's Confession. The Silence of the Guilty. The end of the war brought with it an ominous silence, broken only by the murmur of preparations for trial. The Nuremberg Palace of Justice became the stage where the world would try to understand the abyss of evil. But before the great leaders were tried, came a second series of trials, more specific, more focused on the machinery of horror. One of the most terrifying was the trial of the Einsatzgruppe, military trial number 9. And the most disturbing protagonist of this process was Dr. Otto Ohlendorf. His appearance in court had nothing of the fanatical outburst of other defendants. Ohlendorf, sitting on the bench, did not look like a monster. He seemed like an office worker annoyed by having to explain an accounting error. He carried the same air of efficiency and detachment that he had maintained all his life. He was the man who had shed emotion and fear, leaving only the cold structure of logic in place. The chilling revelation. When the prosecution called him to testify, the world held its breath. Ohlendorf did not accept silence. He did not deny the crimes. In fact, he spoke with technical precision about the methods and figures of the massacre. Her testimony became the most chilling evidence of the systematic planning of the Holocaust. In his voice, dry and didactic, he explained how the Einsatzgruppen operated, how victims were selected, and, most horrifyingly, how executions were carried out. He described the development of orders, from Himmler to himself, and from him to the field commanders. It is here that he pronounced the figure that would remain etched in historical memory. Under his command, Einsatzgruppe D had murdered nearly 90,000 people. Narrator's reflection: there is a difference between the horror of a crime of passion and the horror of a bureaucratic crime. Ohlendorf did not confess with tears of regret, but with the tone of a bank director explaining the year-end balance sheet. It was proof that evil does not need fury, but discipline. His testimony was a map of human coldness, a blueprint of how ideology can annul consciousness, transforming life into a simple statistical variable. The defensive of duty and ideology. Ohlendorf's defense was based entirely on the concept of historical necessity and due obedience. He argued that he and his men were not murderers, but soldiers carrying out orders to protect the future of the Reich and to carry out a necessary ideological cleansing. The interrogation, however, revealed the depth of his involvement. The prosecution asked him about the use of the gas van, the most macabre innovation of his command. Ohlendorf's response was one of the most quoted and frightening of all the Nuremberg Trials. Ohlendorf's testimony: it occurred to me that the firing squad was inefficient, yes. It generated too much psychological stress in my men. In addition, the scene was unnecessarily bloody and messy. That's why we designed the van. People would faint when they reached the grave. It was a cleaner, faster, and above all, less traumatic method for the troops. My duty was to ensure that the mission was accomplished without causing a collapse in the morale of my fighters. He was not concerned with the agony of the victims, but with the psychological well-being of the executioners. This was the pinnacle of their monstrosity, the application of economic rationality to the killing process. He had achieved total dehumanization, not only of those who died, but of those who ordered death. His soul, in fact, had died long before his victims. The ghost of contradiction. In an attempt to humanize his testimony, or perhaps to confuse the court, Ohlendorf introduced elements of his civilian life: his doctorate, his wife, his children, his rejection of Göring's corruption. He tried to project the image of a man of principle who, unfortunately, had been called to perform a terrible duty. I remember his calm. It was the most disturbing thing. There were generals and ministers who shouted, defended themselves with rage. He did not. He was a wall of ice. And when he spoke of his children, of the beauty of the Prussian order, the contradiction was so immense that it hit like a fist. How can a man be so affectionate on one plane and so utterly devastating on another? The answer is that ideology gave him permission to shut down half of his brain. He was not a man, it was a mechanism, the voice of a psychiatrist or a trial observer. Ohlendorf's story on the stand became a lesson in the anatomy of totalitarianism. He proved that you don't have to be a sadist to commit atrocities on a large scale. One only needs to be an efficient bureaucrat, willing to suspend his morality in the name of a superior and abstract order. The prosecution was not only trying a man, he judged the capacity of the human intellect to become poison. Chapter 8. The Interlude of Guilt and Final Waiting. The echo of the sentence. The trial of the Einsatzgruppen concluded in April 1948. The sentences were read with icy solemnity. For Dr. Otto Ohlendorf, the sentence was the death penalty by hanging. The news of the conviction was greeted by Ohlendorf with the same stoic coldness that he had shown throughout the trial. There was no collapse, no cries of innocence, no tears. The man who had sought order all his life accepted the verdict as the logical consequence of a trial, even though he still believed that his cause was just. The next period of his life took place in Landsberg prison, the same place where Adolf Hitler had written Mein Kampf. Landsberg became the purgatory of war criminals, a place of waiting and forced reflection. But could a man like Ohlendorf, who had purged emotion from his being, really reflect on guilt? The Landsberg letters, the persistence of the lie. During the nearly 3 years he spent on death row, Ohlendorf maintained an active correspondence with his wife and children, and with influential figures in Germany who advocated for the commutation of his sentence. His letters are a fascinating and disturbing testimony to the persistence of denial. In none of them did he express genuine remorse for the 90,000 lives he had erased. Instead, he presented himself as a martyr, a man of principle who had been the victim of victorious and hypocritical justice. Excerpt recreated from a letter to his wife. "My dear Marguerite, do not weep. I have not done anything that I should be ashamed of before God or before history. I did my duty, although it was a hard duty. The court judged us by the outcome, not by necessity. I was building a future. Please make sure our children understand that their father was a man of order and loyalty. My only mistake was to have been too efficient." The man who had ordered the deaths of thousands of children wrote to his own children with affection, maintaining compartmentalization until the end. His final betrayal was to the truth. He could not allow himself or his family to admit the monstrosity of his actions. The only way to survive mentally was to believe that the efficiency of evil was the only truth. The battle for commutation, the public lie. Ohlendorf's fate did not depend only on him. In post-war Germany and in the circles of the Cold War that was to come, there was a growing clamor for commutation of death sentences. It was argued that keeping war criminals alive, especially those with military or economic knowledge like Ohlendorf, could be useful. This was an interlude of hope and despair for the condemned. Ohlendorf, The Economist, saw this battle as his last chance to apply his logic. He provided briefings to Americans on the structure of the Nazi economy, offering his expertise in exchange for his life. He used his intellect as a bargaining chip, demonstrating absolute loyalty only to his own survival. The internal confrontation, a lone betrayal. There is a turning point in every soul. In the solitude of his cell, surrounded by 4 cold walls, it is impossible that the ghost of the 90,000 did not visit him. It is said that, on sleepless nights, Ohlendorf would become exceptionally nervous if he heard the noise of a truck approaching the prison, the memory of the gas van being too vivid. His body couldn't betray his mind in court, but in the cell, the body rebelled. He had night terrors that were not panic, but precision. The bodies did not fall cleanly. The bullets missed. The process became disordered in his mind. His nightmare was not guilt, but the inefficiency of his own crime. The voice of a guard or a priest who spent time in Landsberg, noticing the pattern of his torment. It was a moment of lonely betrayal. Ohlendorf's mind, at last, betrayed ideology, not because of morality, but because the reality of the killing was, after all, chaotic and dirty, and not the clean and orderly process he had designed at his desk. The accountant's end, Otto Ohlendorf's appeal, was rejected. The time for commuting had passed. In the early morning of June 7, 1951, in Landsberg prison, the man who had calculated the value of 90,000 lives was taken to the gallows. His last statement was as cold and restrained as his life. "I believe in the German nation. I hope this trial is the ultimate act of revenge." There was no repentance, only the persistence of the ideological lie until the last breath. Dr. Otto Ohlendorf's body was deposited in a mass grave, unnamed, the fate he himself had dictated for the tens of thousands of people under his command. Ohlendorf's story is the definitive testament to how the intellect can be the deadliest weapon when allowed to operate without the guidance of human consciousness. The echo of the 90,000 would silence his name forever. Chapter 9. The legacy of the cipher. 90,000 echoes. The persistence of memory. The noose had tightened, silence had fallen over Landsberg, and Dr. Otto Ohlendorf's body was gone. But the real legacy of the commander of the Einsatzgruppe D was not in his death, but in the figure he himself had provided, 90,000. This number was not just a war statistic. It was the key that opened the understanding of methodical slaughter in the East. 90,000. It's the size of a small town or a football stadium. Ohlendorf was the most devastating witness to his own crime because, unlike others who denied genocide, he documented it. The coldness of his testimony in Nuremberg became the irrefutable link connecting Berlin's ideology with the mud and blood of Ukraine. The challenge of belief. To the post-war world, Ohlendorf's figure was almost incomprehensible. The human mind struggles to process the murder of a single person and is paralyzed by the concept of tens of thousands. The Nazi regime had achieved a feat of terror by making mass slaughter seem abstract. Ohlendorf was the man who put a face to that abstraction, even if it was the face of a bureaucrat. The horror of his confession was not what he said, but how he said it. It forced us to face that the killing was not the work of sadistic lunatics, but of educated men, doctors and lawyers, who had decided that 90,000 lives were a mere logistical problem. The echo of the 90,000 is a reminder that the greatest threat to humanity is heartless rationality. The voice of a historian or a philosopher of the time, trying to understand the psychology of the executioner. The influence on the logistics of extermination. Ohlendorf's contribution to the genocide was not limited to his own Einsatzgruppe. His quest for efficiency in death had ramifications that accelerated horror elsewhere. The gas van design, the technology he had developed in the south to relieve the stress of his troops, was a direct precursor to the fixed gas chambers that were implemented in large death camps such as Chelmno and later Auschwitz. The logic was the same: industrialize murder. The idea of killing victims in transit or invisibly to protect the psyche from executioners became a pillar of the final solution. Ohlendorf was, in essence, an efficiency consultant for hell. His technical legacy, the way he calculated and executed genocide, survived his own death. The ghost of domestic contradiction. The deepest mystery left behind by Ohlendorf is the fracture of his personal life. How could a man who wrote loving letters to his 5 children oversee the annihilation of thousands of families? There is an anecdote recreated from family documents and the patterns of the time that illustrates this abyss. Ohlendorf's eldest son, growing up in the post-war period, is said to have struggled desperately to reconcile the image of the rigid but loving father with that of the mass murderer condemned in Nuremberg. Son's recreated scene. On a cold afternoon in the 1950s, the son finds an old wartime notebook of his father, Otto Ohlendorf. It is not an SS report, but a diary on the management of the family farm. Ohlendorf had meticulously noted crop growth, fertilizer costs, animal welfare, the same level of obsessive precision he used to document the extermination he used to record the care of his land. The son realizes that his father was not an emotional sadist. He was a man whose morality had been replaced by the system. Love and murder were just 2 variables that his mind managed to separate with an ideological wall of steel. Ohlendorf's legacy is that wall, the terrifying human capacity to encapsulate evil within duty, leaving the spheres of personal life and family affection intact. The 90,000 echoes of its victims are the mute cry that reminds us that ideology can be the most potent poison for conscience. His story is a warning that the mask of respectability can hide the most ruthless machinery of extermination. Chapter 10. The Silent Aftermath. The Burden of Survivors. The silence behind the echo. While Otto Ohlendorf's name faded into the court records and public memory of Germany, the pain and destruction he had caused lingered in the east. Southern Ukraine and Crimea became a landscape of mute trauma. The mass graves that his Einsatzgruppe D had left behind were not just graves, they were geographical scars that contained unfinished stories, dismembered families, and the unbearable weight of memory. The real consequence of Ohlendorf's work fell on the few survivors of his massacres. The victims who managed to escape, who hid in the basements, or who survived the march, carried a wound that went beyond the physical. They carried with them the knowledge that death had been organized, planned, and executed with mathematical coldness. The betrayal of the neighborhood. One of the darkest aspects of Einsatzgruppe D's operations, and of which Ohlendorf was fully aware, was local complicity. In many villages, the SS did not act alone. They had the help of local militias or collaborators who, out of fear, resentment, or thirst for revenge, helped to identify and denounce their neighbors. Dramatic anecdote recreated. In a small village near Odessa, Ohlendorf's order was carried out with particularly enthusiastic help from a group of local youths. The commander of the Sonderkommando reported it to Ohlendorf, suggesting a reward. Ohlendorf, the master of distrust, replied with a coldness that chilled his subordinate. Don't reward loyalty that isn't ideological. Those men who betray their neighbors for a little money or a piece of bread will betray the Reich as soon as the wind changes. Use them, yes, but consider them as contaminated as the ones we dispose of. Germany's future cannot be built on opportunistic treachery. Ohlendorf saw human betrayal as an unstable variable that had to be exploited tactically, but never rewarded with confidence. This absolute cynicism about human nature was another layer of their dehumanization. The greatest betrayal that occurred in those camps was that of human against human, and Ohlendorf was the catalyst. The burden of survivors, the imposed silence. The survivors of the Ohlendorf terror often did not find shelter upon returning. In the post-war Soviet Union, the memory of the Holocaust was subsumed under the narrative of the martyrdom of the Soviet people. Jews who returned to their homes, often finding that their property had been taken, faced official silence about the horror they had experienced. This was the silent consequence of Ohlendorf's efficiency. He not only erased lives, but attempted to erase the specific memory of those lives. The trauma could not be shared. It could not be mourned publicly. I remember going back to the house, and the door was open. The family next door, the Ivanovas, had kept our things. When I asked about my father and mother, they told me that they were gone. They didn't dare say that they had seen the van, that they had seen the SS men, that they had seen the officer with glasses. The killing had become a forced secret. Ohlendorf's truth kept killing in the silence and fear of the people who dared to remember. The voice of a survivor, recreated from testimonies. The indissoluble link, economy and death. Even in the post-war period, Ohlendorf's economic legacy persisted. Gold, jewelry, watches and other goods confiscated by Einsatzgruppe D were melted into the Nazi financial system. This money helped sustain the war and financed more crimes. Ohlendorf The Economist had achieved the maximum integration of death and capital. He had shown that genocide could be, in its distorted logic, profitable. This was his final lesson for history. The slaughter was not an act of gratuitous madness, but an enterprise financed with the same zeal with which any other German industry was managed. The blood of the 90,000 fed the war machine. His name, though forgotten on the gallows, is still synonymous with the moment when the bank account became more important than human life. Chapter 11, The Psychology of Order, the Isolated Soul, the wall between duty and conscience. To understand Otto Ohlendorf, it is necessary to delve into the psychological architecture that allowed him to carry out crimes of such magnitude. Psychologists and psychiatrists who studied Nazi war criminals, both in Nuremberg and after, tried to decipher the minds of figures like him. Ohlendorf did not fit the profile of the impulsive psychopath or the passionate sadist. He was, as we have already established, a man of order. His mind had built an insurmountable wall between the sphere of his ideological duty and his human conscience. The duty was the SS, the Reich, efficiency. Conscience was the silenced voice. Ohlendorf was the perfect example of radical obedience, where the intellect is used to justify the total suspension of morality. The problem with Ohlendorf wasn't that he didn't know he was killing. The problem was that he had redefined action. For him, shooting a mother and her son was not murder. It was an execution of racial politics. By using technical jargon, by seeing his victims as burdens or risk factors, he stripped himself of emotional responsibility. His mind had become a cold operating system that executed commands without asking moral questions. He was a human being with the soul of a spreadsheet, the voice of an analyst or psychologist trying to name the pathology of the bureaucrat. The logic of depersonalization. Ohlendorf applied the logic of depersonalization on several levels. First, on the victims, reducing them to figures. Second, about his own men, whom he saw as tools that should be efficient and psychologically stable. His concern about the stress of the shootings was not a shred of humanity, but an interest in the effectiveness of his assassination machinery. This obsession with order manifested itself in the smallest details of his behavior. It is said that, even on the days of greatest pressure at the front, Ohlendorf insisted that reports of casualties and executions be typed with perfect margins and that the ink used should always be black and official. A stain, a correction, a mess on the paper bothered him more than the reality of the mass grave. The aesthetic order of the Hadeth was a substitute for the moral order. The anecdote of absolute indifference, Ohlendorf's utter indifference, was the most frightening feature. An anecdote told by a subordinate illustrates his total disconnection from the emotional reality of the genocide. In the spring of 1942, following a particularly large massacre, the commander of a Sonderkommando approached Ohlendorf in shock. The man, an ancient poet, could not speak. His hands trembled. Ohlendorf, who was reviewing a map, looked up for just a moment. The commander finally managed to murmur about the crying of the children and the image of a girl with a teddy bear. Ohlendorf didn't show an ounce of empathy. He simply took a bottle of liquor from his desk, poured himself a sip, and handed the glass to the commander. "Drink this," he said, "and then make your report. Don't forget to detail the exact number of Roma and make sure that the ammunition spent matches the number of executions. Sentiment is not productive. Duty is. Go back to your post." This moment encapsulates Ohlendorf's psychology, the replacement of human consolation by bureaucratic discipline. He didn't just order killing, he ordered that emotion be annihilated in the process. His soul was not filled with hatred, but with a calculating emptiness, which made him infinitely more dangerous. He was the proof that the worst of evils is the one that is executed with the neat coldness of the law. The condemnation of the deviant intellect. Ohlendorf's life was a warning about the danger of an intellect that operates without the compass of morality. his PhD, his economic knowledge, his organizational ability, all were used to refine and accelerate the extermination. In the end, the system he served consumed him. The gallows was the legal consequence, but the real condemnation was that of his own soul, which had withered and hardened into a mere death algorithm. And that is the darkest lesson that the silence of his last moments left us. Chapter 12, The End of Coolness, the inescapable memory, the conclusion of the horror. The story of Otto Ohlendorf ends in darkness and silence, but his shadow extends over the entire 20th century. He was the embodiment of modern evil, genocide, not as an outburst of tribal fury, but as a state project executed by bureaucrats, academics, and economists with the same logic that would be used to build a road or launch a marketing campaign. His life, from the Prussian farm to the Nuremberg dais, was a path to total dehumanization. He graduated in the art of separating self from duty, transforming human life into an administrative problem that required an efficient final solution. The persistence of indifference. Unlike other war criminals who showed belated repentance or a breakdown of conscience, Ohlendorf maintained his indifference to the end. This lack of remorse should not be interpreted as force, but as the final proof of its own destruction. He had succeeded in convincing himself that he had not acted against morality, but outside of it, on the higher plane of historical necessity. In the final hours, the chaplains spoke with him, but he did not want absolution. I wanted validation. He wanted to be told that his mission, though hard, had been just. When he refused to repent, he did not do so out of pride, but out of intellectual conviction. To him, to admit the mistake would have meant that his whole life, all his logic, all the sacrifices, had been a lie. And that contradiction was a burden that his mind, obsessed with order, could not bear. He died as he lived, a man without moral surrender. The story of the prison chaplain who witnessed his final obstinacy. The memory challenge. The memory of Ohlendorf and the 90,000 is a constant challenge for humanity. It forces us to ask, how strong is the wall that separates civility from horror? How easy is it for the human intellect to become the most effective instrument of terror? The memory of the Einsatzgruppe is particularly important because it shows us the genocide face to face. It was not the factory of death at Auschwitz, where the murderer and the victim were separated by technology and brick walls. It was the firing squad in the ravine, the direct interaction, the smell of fresh earth and gunpowder. And it was Otto Ohlendorf who made sure that this butcher's shop was as well organized as an industrial production line. The Economist's last lesson. Ohlendorf's last lesson is ironic. The man who preached discipline and efficiency saw his ideal Reich collapse into chaos, corruption, and waste. The system by which he betrayed all mankind collapsed because of the very inefficiencies he had criticized. The doctor in economics and commander of death was a failed visionary. His plan for racial and economic order ended in total disintegration. The weight of the 90,000 falls not only on their condemned conscience, but on the collective conscience. They are a reminder that bureaucracy is not neutral. It can be, and often is, the most effective vehicle for evil. The eternal watcher today, Otto Ohlendorf's name resonates as a symbol of the terrifying intersection between intellect, obedience, and mass crime. His story is not just a closed chapter of World War II, but an eternal watchman who whispers a warning to us. Every time technical language is used to obscure truth, every time efficiency comes before morality, every time ideology demands the suspension of conscience, the ghost of the man with the glasses and the impeccable report comes a little closer. The accountant of death paid his price by hanging, but the memory of the figure still demands that we never forget how the most meticulous order can engender the most absolute horror. End of the documentary. And with this, we close the chilling file of Otto Ohlendorf, the man who turned the economy into a weapon of extermination. If this immersion into history has struck you as crucial and revealing as we did, there's something you can do to make sure these stories never get lost. Subscribe to the channel. Don't miss the next chapter of the story, nor the future documentaries that unravel the truth behind the shadows of history. Leave a like. A simple click helps YouTube's algorithm show this work to more people, ensuring that the memory lasts. Comment below. We want to know your opinion. What do you think of Ohlendorf's coldness? What lesson do you think his story leaves us? Share this video. Help us take this historical research to every corner. Your support is what allows us to continue visiting the channel and dedicating the time necessary to investigate and narrate these complex truths with the depth they deserve. Thank you for joining us until the end. See you in the next episode, where we will continue to explore the darkest corners of the story. See you soon.